Hey guys, what is up? I decided I wanted to do one more Spear of the Church video. There were a number of things in my previous video I talked about, and I said in some cases there were things I'd talk about later and then I never addressed them. And there were a number of comments that brought up really good points and things that I should have addressed in the video, and I obviously missed those. And there was some drama that happened between the time that I created the last video and now that I want to clue you into. It's kind of funny. So I'll get into all that and more in this video. I'm trying to work from a script this time because I want to keep this really tight and focused so I can get through this as quickly as possible and I'm not creating another 20-minute video. So for the first thing, the minor points that I missed in my first video, things I should have addressed, that the Night Slayer ring. I definitely recommend this against turtles. Not only do you get the benefit of the Night Slayer for your melee attacks, but you also have the lightning orbs that a lot of people block with their shields, and it does quite a bit of stamina damage. Now, I did do some testing, and I actually had a Reddit post because I couldn't find good data on whether spells were actually buffed by the Night Slayer ring, and it appears that they are not, at least from the testing that we did. So I believe that the lightning soul mass, a miracle of sorts. It's not really a miracle, it's just something that happens to you automatically when you're a spear, but I don't think they get buffed. But even though they're not buffed, those in conjunction with a melee that is buffed by Night Slayer ring, you will crack a lot of guards, and definitely recommend doing that if you're up against a turtle or two. I mentioned in the previous video that I would talk about pyro builds. I never did, and really the point I wanted to make was about a video and a build that Sir Gray made, a spear bully build of sorts, which I think isn't quite like the build that I've created, but is really effective nonetheless. And so if you're not interested in creating a pure faith build, but you want to do something different, definitely check his video out. I've got a link to it in the description. There's also a link to it in the previous video. Casting the spear fragment, I don't remember who made the point, but they mentioned that it gives you poise, and not only does it give you poise when you cast it, and the spear fragment, for those who don't know, that's the item that generates the virtual spears that come out in a row and come out from the ground. Not only do you get poise while you cast it, but it's like perseverance. You get poise for probably 3 to 5 seconds after you cast it, and you already get so much poise. It's maybe not all that helpful, but especially against it in like a 1v1, you may be able to benefit a lot from that poise, because the way the game works, the DS1 poise you do not get until you fight against at least a 2v1, and then you don't get very much. It's really the 3 and 4v1s where you get a lot of the standing poise. Namf actually noticed in the previous video I had a chaos infused Bident. That was really just because I didn't have enough lightning gems. I've solved that problem, so now it's lightning infused, and it does quite a bit more damage. I think I picked up an extra 30 AR or so. Offensive miracles, I get people asking, and just today actually Acto made a point about lightning spear, or I'm sorry, lightning arrow. Lightning arrow is hella useful. It is a great miracle, probably one of the best, but I've got to say I don't recommend using it on a spear build, and the reason is you really have two resources in fixed supply, FP and your health. And every bit of FP that you spend is FP you cannot spend on increasing your health. And so I definitely recommend that you don't do that. It's not to say that lightning arrow couldn't be valuable in a 1v1, it may be, but it's just a general rule. I keep the offensive miracles out. I only keep 2 equipped, even though I have another equipment slot so I could equip it. It just is something else that you have to manage, and you already have so much going on in that fight. Definitely recommend don't do that. If it works for you, great, but for me, I prefer to focus on healing miracles. And one other thing, I have heard in the past of salty spears disconnecting or black crystalline out of a fight that they're in the process of losing, and I'd heard that Half-Light gets summoned in when that happens at full health. Well, I had been doing some co-op, and I've now had 2 players do that to me where they black crystal out when they're losing. But the good news is that Half-Light does indeed get summoned, but he gets summoned in with the same amount of health that the Invader had when he left the fight. So it just ends up making the end very easy, so there's really no harm there at all. So I mentioned that there was some drama since the last video I created. Some folks get hate mail. I've certainly gotten some over time, but this was kind of a step beyond. So credit to Mr. Ragged Man from the Discord. He sent me a link about a week ago. I think it was on the weekend. I was just chilling out, maybe doing some spear invasions at the time, and he sent me a link to a Steam post that somebody had created. So I didn't realize, but Steam has a set of forums akin to Reddit that people post on. And actually, there's a whole section devoted to Dark Souls 3, along with probably every other game that's on Steam. Anyway, this Reddit or this Steam post kind of has to be seen to be believed, but in essence, somebody that I fought as a spear, meaning I was the spear, wrote a lengthy post about how I was a cheater, really didn't provide any evidence, didn't really provide much context, and Mr. Ragged Man happened to see it, saw my name, and so he sent it to me, and I offered a reply in the thread, and I thought it was very polite, kind of assumed that the guy just was salty but had made a mistake and didn't understand how the Spear of the Church system worked, and so essentially tried to reason with the guy. Well, he wasn't very much in a reasoning mood, and so he kind of shifted. Once he realized that I wasn't cheating, he added a bunch of other accusations. Other folks from the community chimed in when they realized what was happening, and this guy was full of shit. Anyway, it was really, really funny. I thought long and hard about this, about whether to include a link to it, to whether even, in fact, to talk about it. Because if I can make a request of you guys, I'd ask that if you do go and read this, please don't chime in. The thread at this point is pretty well dead. I'd rather not resuscitate it. I think this guy's probably suffered enough humiliation as it is. In fact, the only reason I'm bringing it up is because the guy still hasn't apologized, and he still has not actually retracted the accusation of cheating. So find a link to it in the description. It's actually pretty funny. I hope you enjoy that. So next up, I want to talk about critical attacks. As you probably know, my playstyle has changed. I use a lot more critical attacks now. I've actually probably used slightly fewer parries, but I go for a lot more backstabs. And so as a Spear of the Church, you actually get a lot of opportunities to go for backstabs, either to punish Estus or when maybe the host is going after one of the guardians. A lot of the hosts are not accustomed to playing in a PvP environment, and they are especially unaccustomed to playing against multiple opponents. Unless you invade in this game, or maybe if you fight in the arena, you're never ever going to fight more than one human opponent at a time. And for those of us who do a lot of it, it's easy to forget just how much there is to learn about fighting multiple opponents. Anyway, the hosts end up frequently exposing their back because they get too focused on fighting the Guardian, and you can backstab them. That's a great opportunity. But the thing to keep in mind, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is those lightning orbs that form above your head as a spear. They're super awesome. I wouldn't get rid of them. I think they're an incredible addition, and I think actually it's a testament to just how well From thought through this covenant. Those orbs help you in a lot of subtle ways and definitely make your life easier as a spear, but one way in which they can make your life harder is with respect to getting criticals. I cannot tell you how many parries I've gotten where the riposte gets interrupted by the lightning orbs. I can't tell you how many times I've positioned myself for a backstab, but the lightning orbs put the opponent into hit stun, and so I end up not getting a backstab. But this can work to your advantage as well. Sometimes if a host goes for a parry, the orbs may interrupt them before they can get the riposte. Anyway, it just means that if you've got a critical focused gameplay style, you've got to watch it. So what I've learned is when the orbs are up, I don't go for parries, I don't go for backstabs. The only time I do those things is when the orbs are down. And it's just kind of a general point to keep in mind, especially if you're a fisher. The Spear of the Church is probably not really the right place to apply that particular craft. So I want to talk about some of the strategies that I use when I'm a spear, and I mentioned some of these, a subset of these in my previous video, but I kind of wanted to, in one place, address some of the main points I've learned, and in fact, some of the things I've learned since my previous video. So the first thing really comes down to opponent evaluation, right? So is it a 1v1 or is it a 2-3, 4v1? And that's really how I bucket it, because 1v1s fight they play so completely different than the other ones. You don't get any of the poise that you would get with the others in a 1v1. You don't get any of the defense boosts, etc. So in that sense, it's almost like a normal duel with a couple of exceptions. You could have the first guardian still there if the host didn't do a good job of getting rid of him. And by the way, that's usually a really good clue as to the quality of your opponent. If when you arrive, there is only a single opponent and they have either already killed the guardian or are in the process of killing him when you arrive, that generally shows that you've got a good opponent that you're facing off against. But once that first guardian is gone and until the second one shows up, a 1v1 is like a normal duel with the only problem that your opponent can heal and you cannot. Now, there's some ways that you can heal that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but they're much more easy to punish when it's only a 1v1. They're harder to punish when it's a 2, 3, 4v1. But there's also a question of fairness around that sort of healing, which I'll get to in a little bit. But 1v1s can be tough, especially if your opponent's any good, because even if your opponent is only, let's say, 60% as good as you are, they are probably going to beat you just because they can keep healing and you cannot. You do want to press your advantages when you get them in a 1v1, and we'll talk about some of the strategies that I use for that here in just a moment. It's not a duel, it's a boss fight, and so you can't think of it like that. Like I've lost fights to players that I know I'm better than, and in fact I had one just the other day where I probably made him run through like 11 of his Estus, and aside from I think 2 regen casts, I didn't heal at all, and so the regen amounted to probably like a single Estus. And he pointed down at me after he beat me, and I'd actually beat him twice before, but I just had to accept that it's a boss fight, that he's supposed to be able to win, so you just can't get too worked up about that. Undead Hunter Charms, I really cannot emphasize this enough. I have incorporated these into my normal invasion gameplay, but they are huge when you are a Spear of the Church, because you can totally neutralize your opponent's lone advantage against you, which is their ability to heal. I don't recommend just using them normally. I've encountered spears that just start chucking these things around left and right. Don't do that. Wait till your opponent is at low health. A backstab is the perfect opportunity to do that. And you'll see some video today of me doing this. And actually, I learned this from Project Goof. And if you time it correctly, it is inescapable. They cannot avoid the Undead Hunter Charm. And so if you see in the clips, you'll see what I'm doing. Definitely recommend using those, and then you can put a lot of pressure on them and chase them down. And in those same sorts of situations, especially again in a 1v1, you have to avoid damage. If I'm fighting a player normally, let's say I've got a straight sword and they do 2, and I'm beating them at 5-1, meaning doing 5 times as much damage to them as they are to me, I'm going to win. That may not be enough to get the job done in a Spear of the Church fight. So when I encounter a player who seems to have an idea of what they're doing, I switch to the spear because it lets me avoid a lot more of the risk of getting hit, and I can hit them from afar and not have to trade with them. That's also true if they're laggy, because sometimes you can't avoid trading against the laggy opponent. So the spear isn't just for chasing people down. It can also be useful to space them out and be able to attack them essentially risk-free. Get your spear fragment leveled up. The spear fragment levels up to divine when you get 30 of the covenant items. It does twice as much damage once it's upgraded. Definitely recommend that. And the spears that it generates, they're useful for a myriad of things, for safely healing, for splitting parties apart, for getting them off the guardians, for cornering them. They're really, really useful. So get that thing upgraded as soon as you can. You can abuse poise. When you have multiple opponents, you have DS1 style poise. So you can do all sorts of nifty things like poise BS like you would in DS1. You can parry the second R1 of a straight sword. And I'm here to tell you that even though I know all these things are true, when I fight spears from the other side, these things are so habitual that I forget. And I myself have gotten parried on the second R1. So you can definitely leverage those sorts of tactics against larger groups. Keep your item bar clean, and what I mean, like your consumable items, only keep there what you absolutely need, because every item you add is something else you got to sort through when you're trying to find the thing that you want. And for mine, it's pretty clear. I only keep Ashen Estus on there. I don't even have regular Estus on there. I remove it from my spear build. I keep both dual and undead hunter charms. I use dual charms when somebody's got a buff, like somebody the other day had Dark Moon Blade on the twin axes, and that had to come off straight away. Or if somebody has a buff on the cell swords, that's really dangerous, and I'll go and I'll strip that as well. But then I also keep lightning urns, throwing knives, and of course the divine fragment. A word about aggression. You really have to be aggressive in 1v1s. You've got to keep pressure on the other opponent. You've got to try to make space for punishing them. You can't afford to engage them in a battle of attrition. Even if you're willing to go full douche and heal as much as you possibly can, and we'll talk again more about that later, you're going to have a very difficult time outlasting all 15 of their Estus. So your best strategy is to get them down to, say, half health or lower, try to get them undead hunter charmed, and then run them down with a spear. That's really your optimal strategy. So healing miracles, when you heal, if you stand in the spear fragments, this almost makes you untouchable. Now, if they've got things like lightning arrow, projectiles, spells, they can still hit you. So what you can actually do is go off to the side of the arena and then cast the spear fragment behind one of the pillars. And then you're protected on front and back by the spear fragment. You're protected on the left side by the wall, and then on the right side you're protected by the pillar, and you are almost essentially untouchable. And in some sense it can make the fight unfair, but more about that later. So when you heal, I already went through the miracles that I use. You want to think about FP. In other words, you need to think about how much attunement and corresponding FP you have on your build, and then you want to think about how much FP each cast is going to consume. And the thing you also need to keep in mind is that as you add phantoms to the Spear of the Church fight, you get an FP bump, and I think it's an additional 10% for each phantom that gets added. And so think about how many multiples of each spell you can get cast off. And as soon as you run out of FP, you immediately want to drink an Ashen Estus. Don't wait till later, because otherwise it is a big clue to your opponents that you're getting ready to heal, and you want to try to surprise them if you can. And along those lines with surprising them, don't wait till you're at really low health. Try to heal around half health, and that way, A, they won't suspect it, and B, if they start wailing on you or they backstab you, it's not going to kill you straight away. If you choose to engage in healing in these spear fights, be ready for salt, be ready for disconnects. Now, the guy that wrote the salty Steam post about me, I actually don't know that I healed against him, and that wasn't actually what he was even complaining about in his post, but you will run into a lot of salty people. I've had people start throwing shit at me, sarcastic applause. I've had plenty of disconnects, and I'm sure had I been on PS4, I would have gotten plenty of salty messages. But just be ready for that. People will not be happy with you when you use that, when you use the approach of healing. And speaking of healing, things like Soothing Sunlight actually have a pretty big area of effect. And if you're strategic about it, you can actually get the Guardian inside the healing radius. And especially if you're up against like a 3 or 4v1, keeping that Guardian topped off can provide a very useful distraction, and he will do a lot of damage over time. And in fact, when you're against a large number of opponents and you're healing, you can actually turn this fight into a battle of attrition, where you essentially bleed the phantoms out of all their Estus. The host will still have Estus, but you bleed the phantoms out, and then essentially you can go and pick them off one at a time, and that's been a very effective strategy of mine. And again, because you have higher defenses, each point of HP is worth something like 5 to 7 times its normal value. So even if you can only equip, let's say, Heal Aid or Heal, and it's a negligible amount of health normally, it's probably not negligible in a spear fight. So even an extra 200 HP in a 4v1 could easily let you withstand 5 or 6 R1s. So just keep that in mind too. Last of all, I want to talk about spear counter strategy, the sorts of things you can do when you're fighting against a spear. And I also want to talk about kind of my overall feelings about healing as a Spear of the Church and the strategy and whether I think it's overpowered. So for spear counter strategy, it really depends. And I'm assuming here that when I talk about counter strategy, it's in a group. and it's against somebody who's trying to heal. If it's just somebody who doesn't have a specialized spear build, then it's really not such a difficult thing to do. Although if it's a 3 or 4v1, you just have to be very careful that you don't commit to lengthy attacks, because you can get parried. They can trade with you. They're not going to get staggered. You've just got to remember that. That's really important to keep in mind. If you have spells, things that you can use to punish them from a distance or when they're trying to heal, that's great, and you should use those. Alternatively, what you can do, and this is generally my approach, especially if I'm fighting them by myself and then they cast the spear fragment and they heal in between, there's really not much I can do to punish it. And that's fine. I just let them heal, because I think it's 3 Ashen Estus that you get it, maybe 4. I'd have to go back and double check. But there's a limit to how much healing they can do. And I'm generally good enough that I'm going to beat them regardless. So I just don't worry too much about it. But you can take either approach, really. The only problem is if it's like a 4v1, you get a 30% bump to FP plus all your Ashen Estus. Plus, like in my case, I have FP regen on my shield, and over the course of a 4v1, which could easily be 5, 6, 7 minutes long, that can amount to quite a bit of FP. So that can be a challenge. Don't bring patches. I've mentioned this before. I don't get it. So many people summon patches, and patches is just frankly awful. He's worthless, and all you're doing is buffing the spear. Don't ever bring patches, even if you're by yourself. Now, Skitter actually told me something interesting that he does, which is he summons patches and then sends patches back home via Black Crystal after the boss fights, so that he buffs the spear so that it makes it a bigger challenge. So if you're like Skitter, feel free to do that. Give yourself a bigger challenge. I think it's actually kind of interesting and something I need to give a try to. But if you're just trying to win, don't bring him. Dual charms. So I had read that dual charms will strip healing buffs. Actually, they would strip miracles like Tears of Denial. And so I've been testing it out. Can't speak to what it does for Tears of Denial, but I can tell you from the testing that I've done, it does not stop healing. So first of all, it won't stop the miracle from being cast. And even after it's been cast, if it's a healing over time miracle like Bountiful Sunlight, it won't, or I'm sorry, Bountiful Light. I presume the same thing's true for Bountiful Sunlight, but it won't stop the regen. So unfortunately, they have no value in that particular way. I did notice something interesting, which is poison. So even though the damage that you do to the spear in a 3-4v1 whatever is seriously nerfed, it did not appear to me that poison damage is nerfed, which means it effectively gets a huge buff. So something to consider. If you're in like a 3 or 4v1, it might be worth throwing on some poison resin on a dagger and trying to get the spear poisoned. So in summary, one of the things I want to talk about is whether this particular build and the strategies that I employ is whether it's overpowered. And the answer in a nutshell is I think yes, I do think it's overpowered. And one of the problems that it creates is it creates kind of this a fight of extremes, meaning if you get a spear in a 4v1 that isn't a faith build, you're just going to run him down, and he's not likely going to have enough tools at his disposal to kill all 4 team members. Now, there's, of course, always exceptions to that, but by and large, the 4v1 is going to steamroll you, especially if they have a lot of casters. They're going to really be able to have their way with you. But on the flip side, if you have a lot of healing miracles like Soothing Sunlight and you abuse the spear fragments to heal, then you are almost unstoppable, and you can turn the entire fight into just a simple battle of attrition of health, and you will almost always be able to win a battle of health attrition. So I think probably the way that I would personally fix this is I would give spears a special sort of miracle like the spear fragment. Any spear can cast it. It heals a fixed amount of health or a fixed percentage or whatever you want to do, and you can vary how many times it can be cast. You can tune it that way, but that way every spear has the benefit of the same ability to heal, and then you can prevent them from using normal healing miracles, and that way you kind of keep it in even ground, and every spear has the same strategy available to them, and it's not really dependent on them creating an entire build around it. So that's how I would approach nerfing that. And for me personally, when I encounter a solo host, I don't use Soothing Sunlight. I only use the regen just because it's too overpowered, and I think it's kind of unfair to hosts, especially because the game isn't as busy now. And so it is very common for me to get summoned by the same solo host 2, 3, 4, 5 times in a row, and then they start disconnecting. And I don't want to create a miserable play experience for anyone. So thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. Thanks for checking in. Take care now.